Welcome to the wonderful world of wine. We are your hosts, Mark Lenzi and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. Our program is supported by Franklin Public Radio, and you can find out all about our show on our website, thewww.wine. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the wonderful world of wine. How are you, Kim?
I'm fabulous, Mark. Good to talk to you again.
You too. It's always great to talk wine with our listeners. And today we have a very special guest. Kelli White is here from Napa Valley. How are you, Kelli?
I'm great. So happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time. For our listeners, Kelli is the Director of Education for the Wine Center at Meadowood in Napa Valley. She is a sommelier, a wine writer, and an author of a few books. One is The Wine Confident. There's no wrong way to enjoy wine, and also Napa Valley Then and Now. So Kelli, can you please start out by telling our listeners about your career in wine? And I read that you actually started here in Mass, and can you please explain the term wine baby talk?
Oh, okay, sure. I'm from Massachusetts, born and raised in Charlton, Massachusetts. Shout out to the rest stop on the Pike.
Woohoo, Western Mass.
Went to high school in Worcester and college outside of Boston. And my family's still in the Brookfield. So I love Massachusetts. I'm back all the time. And I started working in wine shops in Boston in college and then in Cambridge in college. And that was how it all started.
A similar story too. I think a lot of us. You have to get your feet wet in the industry and do your time, lugging cases and selling wine. Then we kind of move into other things. What was it about wine that made you decide that this was something that you wanted to pursue for your career?
Well, at first I didn't get it. I was studying other things. I truly thought it was just a kind of a stopgap college job experience, nothing more serious than that. But I really fell in love with wine, not so much like the actual alcoholic beverage at first. First, I fell in love with the subject matter. And for me, it was this kind of perfect intersection of all of these things that I cared about intellectually. Like there was a lot of science there if you wanted to take it there and go down that particular pathway. There's obviously a lot of ties to human culture, to travel, to language, to food, to fine art. It really was so deep and so rich that was what brought me in first. And it kind of took me a while to find the wines that spoke to me, but I got there eventually. And then once I did, then it really was off to the races.
Kelli, I want to ask a lot of questions today about your book, Wine Confident. First off, Karen McNeil stated books like this are rare. I totally agree. I think you covered wine basics really well, and you gave some super tips in the book. You stated that people stay away from wine due to fear, and there's no such thing as a wrong wine. Can you share some of the tips of how people can not be afraid of the wine world?
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite frankly speaking from experience, not only my own anxiety when I was getting to know wine as somebody that wasn't raised with it. I just was really worried about mispronouncing things. I was worried about ordering the wrong things, doing the wrong wine pairing. And all those fears felt really big because the thing about wine is that I think for both better and worse, it's kind of bound up with notions of class and sophistication. So if you kind of do wine wrong, you're sort of telling on yourself as maybe being not a sophisticated person, right? So the longer I got in the wine industry and I'm learning all about food and wine pairings and I'm learning all the different languages and I'm learning how to do quote unquote everything right, the more I realize like this is a lot of the things that we receive, a lot of the information we receive in wine and we're told that these are the rules. There's really no downside to breaking them. Like there's no need to be this anxious about food and wine pairings. There's never been a food and wine pairing so bad that like somebody is stormed out of your house, right? Like that's not a real scenario. It's relatively low risk, right? Like glassware that I prefer for certain glasses, but the longer, and my husband's in the wine industry too, the longer we're here, the more we're just using universal glasses for everything. So we're two wine geeks moving away from that as well. And it just feels like, gosh, I wish somebody had come to me early in my career and said, you know what, don't actually worry about that stuff. Like worry about falling in love first. Like but focus your energy on the parts of this that excite you, not the things that you're worried about getting wrong. Like let that go, you know. And that doesn't mean that different wine glass shapes aren't valuable. And it doesn't mean that, you know, you shouldn't attempt to execute a good food and wine pairing. It just that I think there's an overemphasis in these like quote unquote rules in our basic wine dialogue that is really alienating a lot of people and turning them off.
Yeah, it's like that whole, it's like, I like to tell people that like everyday work, there are no wine emergencies. Like nobody's life is hanging in the balance. If I don't get the pairing right or I don't pick exactly the right wine for a class, this is enjoyment and it should be something that we can appreciate and take seriously. But on the other hand, you don't have to completely stress yourself over it. So I completely love your take on it. And I feel like your story is kind of also my story. We've kind of gone the same direction. Like, the more you know, the more you can kind of take it easy. And I think that that's one of the benefits of a book like yours is that you can get people to understand that, yeah, this doesn't have to be this super stressful thing. Like, come along for the ride and enjoy it and just taste some wonderful wine.
Well, I love what you said about there being no wine emergencies.
There's no emergencies.
It feels so true. I was at a party the other day, and because I live in wine country, you know, almost everyone I interact with is in wine in some capacity. And I looked around at the group and everybody's in wine. And I said, I love you people, but we are so useless. Like, where are the doctors at? Where are the lawyers in this friend group? Like, God forbid there's an earthquake right now. Like we would all be in really rough shape.
Like if somebody needs the Heimlich maneuver, you're all screwed because you don't have any
Can't help you. Can it be removed? Can the object be removed with an ASO? Like maybe that's what we can offer. That's the sort of emergency skill set that we have.
Yeah. We are completely useless during the zombie apocalypse. Absolutely.
Kelli, one subject that's mentioned a lot in the wine world is when people say a wine is corked. Can you explain corked wine, how it can be detected, and your tip that you told in the book about decanting to verify that a wine is corked?
Yeah. So first of all, if people are confused about this word, they should be. It's just the worst term I've ever heard. Because people sometimes hear a wine is corked and they think that just means that it has a cork, right? Because some wines are screw cap and some can. So obviously that's not what we're talking about. But if a wine is bottled under cork, if it does have a natural cork, there's a possibility that cork could be subject to an invisible taint called TCA, right? Which we have shortened to cork taint. Totally imperfect term. And basically the way you would know if your wine is tainted in this particular way, which happens to a shocking number of bottles. When I was coming up in the wine industry, it was thought to be 5%, which is, you know, roughly one bottle in every 2 cases. It's less than that now, but still any person that drinks a reasonable amount of wine has encountered a bottle with cork taint. The way that you would experience cork taint in a wine would be usually through a very kind of musty quality to the nose, but it's a specific kind of must because sometimes older bottles might also smell a little musty. So in the book, I say to decant the wine because if a bottle is just sort of old, right? It's been closed for 25 years or something. And it's like throwing open the shutters in a house. It might need a little air to clear out the funk. But if a bottle is tainted and you decant it, it will just get worse. So if it's just a little bit old or a little bit musty, a little funky, decanting might clear that up and you would notice it would be a lot cleaner tasting in 5, 15, half an hour. But if the bottle has TCA, has this specific infection in the cork, it will just get way worse. And so that's a pretty good way to learn the difference.
Mark is a big proponent of decanting and decanting lots and lots of things. So I'm sure that he's very happy
decant milk,
to hear this.
Decant it all.
Yeah, I just get disappointed that, well, I don't say disappointed, but my threshold now for TCA is very low. I keep finding them and...
like you can smell them and taste them.
Yeah, I can
even if it's very, very mild.
Better now and something new, I guess.
It's heartbreaking.
Do you think it's just, is it an experience thing, do you think, Mark? Is it?
Yeah, I think the more you taste, the more you detect it.
Is it an age thing? No.
It's just, people are bringing wines into me to try all the time, as with you guys, and I'm saying, no, I think it's corked.
Yeah.
And then when I read your tip tip, Kelly, about decanted to verified. I never do that for a corked wine because it's usually a sample. It's not something from a collection or something like that.
Right. Well, sometimes, and quite frankly, if it's a young wine and it's really musty, there's really no reason for a very young wine to smell super musty. So probably if it's a young wine and it smells that way, it is in fact tainted. My tip was more like if it's also old, but it's a tough thing to learn. And one of the points I make in the book is that it's worthwhile to try to figure out the specific taint of cork taint, because sometimes you might just try a wine that's tainted and think, this wine isn't good, not there's something wrong with this wine. You might just think, oh, I don't like it. And then that's kind of doing a disservice to whoever recommended it to you, whoever made it. You might think, oh, they're no good at their job, when really it's kind of beyond anybody's control and that it has this invisible problem. It's definitely worth chasing that down. Talk to your local store. When I worked in wine shops, I had somebody that really wanted to understand what this smelled like. And they said, listen, I live down the street. If you ever have a corked bottle of wine, give me a call. I want to come in. I want to smell it. I want to know what this tastes like. So that can be helpful, although I know that's a little bit elaborate.
Sometimes it could take a lot to go down the street, but I see what you mean. Like really one of the best ways to understand what a corked bottle is all about is just to have that experience. And I know that from teaching some of my classes, every once in a while we'll open up a bottle and it'll be corked. And on the one hand, it's like, bummer. Like now we can't actually have a good representation of what this wine is all about. But then on the other hand, it's like, yay, now you all get to smell what a corked bottle is smelling like, and you now have that experience. So even when it's an expensive bottle, I had a corked bottle of champagne, which is so unusual.
That's the worst. Yeah,
it's both the worst and not very common. So I'm one of those like make lemonade out of lemons kind of people. So I like when I have that experience, like not so great that you don't get to taste the wine, but at least the people who are trying to learn from you do get the experience of smelling what a corked bottle is all about. And you're right that it is not something that a lot of just casual consumers really have a lot of experience with. And if you randomly get a corked bottle at a restaurant, and if you don't drink wine all the time, you might just think, oh, okay, this is just not such a great bottle. But that's, I think, really, really important information for people to know.
This is also why I'm an advocate of sommeliers tasting the wine before consumers.
Yeah, totally.
Just to safeguard against that.
Kelly, I want to talk about something that Kim and I are always hitting our listeners up with is a wine story and the importance of that. And you say the best wines have a human connection. Can you explain that as this relates to a wine story?
Yeah, I mean, a big part of the thesis of the book was trying to encourage people to form a deeper connection to wine other than just like an alcoholic beverage you have, on the couch at night. And I think one of the things that makes wine so special is that a lot of different hands touch a bottle of wine before it gets to you. And if you read about wine even a little bit, you've probably come up against some of these stories. Usually in wine media, they're talking about the wine founders or maybe the winemaker, or maybe if you're lucky, the grape grower. But for every one kind of big marquee name, there's dozens of hands that have touched it, including the people that sold it to you, including the people that recommended it to you, including the people that you're sharing it with. I think if you consider sort of the human network that surrounds each bottle of wine, that can be, I think, very powerful and help form connections to this product that I'm obviously very passionate about. You can also consider your own life in the context of that wine based on things like the vintage, what was going on in your life at that time, what is a story, what was happening at the same time. It's a sort of an invitation to reflection, which is harder and harder to come by in our very busy digital lives, right? I think you can also, if you travel at all, if you bring wines back from places that you visited, they don't need to be fancy. It doesn't even need to be from there. If it's a wine you bought in a wine store in Washington, D.C., because it caught your eye and you brought it home. Things like that. You start layering these human stories on top of this beverage, and it takes on an increasing level of significance. And for me, that's one of the most moving and important things about wine, is what keeps me coming back for more.
I love that whole idea of the entire chain. It's not just who's the name behind the wine or what's the label on there. And we do talk a lot about, or at least we're starting to talk about, who are the boots on the ground and who are the hands who are picking the grapes and making the wine. But I also, I like that idea of following it all the way through to who's the person who's giving you that recommendation, because we've all been that person, or at least the three of us have all been that person to recommend that bottle. And oftentimes there is a reason and there is an emotional connection and a story. And I know that I certainly have always had favorite customers who have touched my heart over the years that I've been like, here is a special bottle for you for a holiday or a special occasion. And it's almost like you're giving a gift to somebody else. So that idea that wine is not just some other food product, there is something special about the follow through with kind of this camaraderie and this culture that goes along with wine.
Yeah. And, I was a sommelier a long time ago, and I still meet people that will say to me, I came to your restaurant and you recommended this bottle of wine to me and I loved it and I still think about it. I mean, how incredible is that? Yeah, that's the best. I mean,
I know. And then it's like, I'm so good. I was so good at my job. It just makes you feel really, really good. Oh, totally get that.
It's just these layers and layers of human connections and all through the medium of wine.
Thank you for listening to us today on The Wonderful World of Wine. We are your hosts, Mark and Kim, and today with our special guest, Kelli White. You can find our past episodes on SoundCloud and iTunes. You can find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine and our website, which is thewww.wine. Our special guest today is Kelli White. She is an author who has a number of books that you can find online. We have Napa Valley thenandnow.com as her website, and you can also find her on Instagram at Kelli White Wine, and that is Kelli with an I. Welcome back to The Wonderful World of Wine, everyone. We are Kim and Mark, and today we are talking to author Kelli White, who has been telling us all about the wine experience and how that makes connections with other wine consumers and people in the world. But I think that Mark probably wanted to talk a little bit more about Kelli's books. I know certainly your newer book we sell on our website, actually, at Commonwealth Wine School. Yeah, we do Academy Van books. So I know that when yours popped up for me take a look at on our website, I was like, oh, I'm going to talk to her. So that one was actually really exciting.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. So people can find that on the Commonwealth Wine School site. But so interesting between your two books, because one is very focused on Napa and the wines of Napa Valley, in particular the history of the region, whereas the other one is a little bit broader, learning about wine, but getting to appreciate wine regardless of where you are in your wine journey. But I wanted to talk a little bit about your focus on Napa. So you said before that you are from Massachusetts. Where did this focus on Napa and California come from?
It was another one of those moments of serendipity, because when I was working in Boston and New York, my career was much more oriented towards European wines. But I was living and working in New York, and the gentleman who's now my husband was opened a wine bar the week the market crashed. And we had afterwards, it sort of caused a what's next, what's happening conversation. And he wanted to learn how to make wine. And so we cast around for sommelier jobs in wine country somewhere and just happened to find work in Napa Valley. So it wasn't a passion that brought me to Napa. It was practicality. We had a job, we had a way to pay the bills while Scott learned how to make wine. And so that's what brought us out here. And when we were here, I happened to be coming off of a sommelier experience at Veritas in New York, which closed, I think, back in 2013. So maybe a lot of your listeners aren't familiar with it, but at the time it was one of the biggest wine lists in the world, and it had a lot of older vintages. And I just fell in love with older wine specifically. And so when we got to Napa Valley, one of the things that was really interesting is that nobody was drinking older wine, but there was older wine around. And when you could find it, it was generally really inexpensive. And so we started to really get excited about the older vintages, started to feature them on the wine list at press. And meanwhile, I started to foment this idea of maybe writing a book about Napa Valley, because I didn't really know anything about Napa when we moved out here, and I wanted to read about it in book form, right? I'm not a website person, or that was especially true back then. on, I wanted to buy a book and read the book and sit with it on my lap and turn pages and have that whole kind of sensory experience. That's how I like to consume information. And there really wasn't a very serious book on Napa. And so I kind of combined the two ideas, one of just writing a primer on Napa as a region, but folding in the experience I was having of drinking all these older vintages, which were really not being talked about really in any capacity in the wine media landscape. And so that resulted in the Napa book, which came out in 2015, which was self-published, way too big, such a big book, but obviously changed my life. And I'm very proud of it. But this book, as you implied, is different in every way. It's much more casual in tone, much more broad, introductory based rather than sort of being specialized or having a higher level of expertise, and much more friendly in tone, and of course a lot smaller.
Kelli, in the Wine Confident, you talked about wine tasting and how to taste wine, and you described how wine tastes as if it seems hard at first, and you said that's because it is hard to figure out the tasting and what you're tasting. How important is it for our listeners who are starting out in wine to develop and understand what their profile is? And can you explain what you meant by calibrating your palate?
Yeah, this is something that is really important to me. And to be completely honest, I'm still figuring out how best to talk about it. I took a lot of time to discuss this in the book because I feel like of all of the kind of wine questions, wine stumbling blocks, points of anxiety for people, this one is particularly sticky. And problem is that I think the wine industry has put forward this way of talking about wine. Best or only way to appreciate a glass of wine is to stick your nose in it and to pull out very specific adjectives. And that is really hard to do for a lot of reasons, including just coming down to the basics of our neurobiology, which, I get into a little bit in the book, but also because wine is just really, really complex aromatically and completely abstract, right? There's no visual indication necessarily of what you might smell or not smell, but it's also just putting words to abstract smells is a really hard thing for our actual brains to do, right? And yet people think well, if I can't do that, then I'm not doing it right. And so in writing this book, I wanted to focus on these pain points. And for me, that's a big one. And the story that I tell in the book that was really clarifying to me was I had this woman come, she had signed up for a wine class, and in between signing up for the wine class and taking the wine class, she'd had a kind of sort of bad experience at a winery. And she said that she knew to wine, and she sat down at this winery and they gave her a glass of wine, and the tour guide said, "So what do you taste in this wine?" And I am so sure in my heart that this person was very well intentioned and, was just trying to draw them out, engage them in a conversation. But what this person felt was terror, of anxiety. They just smelled wine. They couldn't articulate it any more than that. And so it became this really awkward interaction. And this person's takeaway was, I guess wine is just not for me. I can't do that thing that you guys do.
Yeah.
And the reality is, I think that is only one way to talk about wine. And it's kind of exciting. I mean, you get a thrill when you pick out a specific scent like jasmine or chamomile or shoe polish or something from a glass of wine. It's like
I call it the
sparkles
aha.
going
It's
off
the
your
aha
brain.
moment. I call it the aha moment. It's like, I got that the first time I smelled green bell pepper on a Cabernet. It was like,
Yeah.
like my world has opened up.
Yeah, and it's a totally cool thing to do, and we chase that high. And I think that some of these smells are in there, and it's thrilling. But that's not all there is to it, right?
Totally.
Wine also has a lot of texture. Wine has a personality. Wine might remind you of other things other than bell peppers or chamomile, right? It might feel shy to you, or exuberant, or intellectual, or easy, or reticent. The wine might be lush, or soft, or creamy, or bold. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to talk about it. You can use personality types. We tend to use a lot of comestibles in the way we talk about wine. You can use poetry and emotion, right? There's all sorts of ways to describe about wine. And anybody buying this book or taking one of your wine classes or listening to a wine podcast is probably already bought into the notion that wine elicits an emotional response. If it does, otherwise there wouldn't be any podcasts about wine. There's no podcast about broccoli, right? So I
was going to say carrots, but yeah.
Right, carrots. It's an emotional, it triggers an emotional response. So then to say, okay, like you can feel those emotions, but when you talk about wine, don't talk about that. We want you to talk about broccoli. We want you to talk about very specific smells and tastes. It just feels like such a disconnect. And I think it's, again, really alienating and off-putting. And it also is like very specific to one culture, which is one of the things that wine has been reckoning with, especially in these last several years, is opening up the frame, opening up these references so that we're not expecting everybody to speak like a 90-year-old British man when talking about wine, to make it a little bit more universal. And so I think we can achieve that by leaning into the more emotional aspect of wine, by being more vague and less specific when talking about descriptors, but then also calibrating your palate. To your question, Mark, one of the people I talk about in the book was an interior designer whose way to describe texture in wine was fabric related. Now, this woman knew more about fabric than I ever will, and she could probably easily leave me in her dust if she wanted to be really very specific. The point was not necessarily to communicate to me, but to first kind of calibrate and communicate about wine to herself using words that she understood and references that she understood intuitively, rather than try to assume quote unquote proper wine speak and use language that she might not naturally feel connected to.
So, Kelly, as a retailer, I love that you highlighted in the book gifting wine. And you said a few things that I thought were just phenomenal. You said there's no easier gift than wine. And your taste in wine is personal. And giving someone a wine shows you're passionate about giving a little piece of yourself. Can you talk about that statement and what you define as a fine wine?
Sure. So I'll go with the easy one first. This is the first half of the question. Yeah, I mean, I actually wrote a little bit more about this in the book, and it ended up getting cut. But, I was born in 1980, so I grew up making mixtapes for people I like, and I still do that, like not just like crushes, but friends. And here are some songs that made me think of you, and I've organized them in a specific way. And I think wine can be a lot like that too. You can choose a wine for somebody because you think it's right for them, or you can share a wine with somebody because you're sort of showing them something about yourself, an experience you've had, or just your preferences, etc. And so it's a really beautiful thing. And the other piece about it is that we live arguably in incredibly isolating times. We spend, half the day looking through the world through our phones. I think that my use report said 6.5 hours a day I'm on my phone. The other day I almost passed out, but it's hard to escape. So if you give somebody a bottle of wine, even if they don't open it with you, they will probably think about you, and they will probably also drink it with someone else. So just the sheer existence of a bottle of wine, opening it is inviting human connection. And so I think that that's something that we should be talking about more, especially in the face of all these kind of doom and gloom articles about is all alcohol bad for your health, and in all measurable ways. Well, there's a lot to be gained from a mental health perspective by sitting down, slowing down, breaking bread with people that we love or that we're getting to know, forming new friendships, new interests, things like that. So I think wine has a lot of weaponry to combat some of these loneliness problems, isolation, and to form intimacy. So that was my sort of way of talking about that. And it's also, unlike flowers, like it can be easily regifted if somebody doesn't drink. It's just the perfect gift. Everybody should buy everybody some wine. And then in terms of what defines a fine wine, that's tricky, but I'm sure I talked about this in the book. But for me, like a fine wine, a wine that I care about, and I don't think it needs to be fancy wine. I think fine wine is different. Doesn't have to be expensive, doesn't have to be rare, but it just needs to sort of be obviously well made. That's the sort of least of it, but it needs to be grown. It needs to be from a place. One of the things that I think makes wine so special in comparison to other alcoholic beverages is that it is an agricultural product. It's reflective not only of place. Most wines are labeled according to where they're from, but also time, the year in which they're grown, and the 4 seasons that year contained. That's a profound anchor in time and space. And so for me, fine wine, like my mother's favorite wine is like sparkling pineapple wine from Trader Joe's. It's delightful. It's lovely. I drink it with her. It's a nice memory. It's a tasty, tasty wine. I don't have the same relationship with that wine that I do with other wines where I have a connection to the place or, the process and things like that. So I think it needs to be grown rather than sort of produced, because some of the mass produced wine, and And again, like God bless these wines because a lot of them are the gateway drug that get people drinking, quote unquote, better wine. But a lot of the more mass produced wines that are sort of made to be a product to appeal to just certain flavor profiles, to be engineered for mass pleasure, to be kind of thoughtlessly consumed. Again, like that's great. But wines that are created in a laboratory or a think tank or a focus group is different than a wine that's grown, I guess, and reflective of place and time. So that's a kind of a really long-winded, rambly way of saying what I think I mean. To a tough question.
This is like something that we talk about all the time. It's like the wine as commodity versus wine as something that is an agricultural product that is tied to who grew it, who made it, their family story. Like it's a complicated thing. And it's like on one level, we can talk about the flavor profile of a wine and that whole way of approaching assessment of a wine. And then we get into this more nitty gritty about it and this like deeper understanding of it beyond a beverage. And I know that oftentimes we talk about this topic of wine being this sort of cultural identifier, but also for like people who are from backgrounds who wine is a regular part of the diet. Talk about Italian wines, Spanish wines, and French wines, and things like that, where that is more of a food and less of a wine. And it's like, is wine a product? Is wine a food? And there are so many layers that you can talk about wine and what it means, or just what it tastes like. So it's so interesting and wonderful to talk to people who understand kind of all those levels. It's like you can talk about it with somebody who is just learning about wine and just let's talk about the flavors that you like, the textures that you like, that kind of a thing. Or we can get in deeper about what is the cultural meaning behind this beverage or this producer or how it pairs with a particular food and things like that. So yeah, it's always wonderful to speak with people who have that understanding that there are those layers to the topic. And Mark and I certainly understand that. And we love to just spend a little while hashing it out with other smart people who feel the same way about wine.
Oh, that's great.
I have to talk about something that I hope the listeners will read this themselves in the book, but you mentioned a couple of ordering tips, and you said when you're going to order, tell what was the last wine you enjoyed. I thought that was a really good way to tell people to basically tell their profile when they're ordering. And you also said about pointing on the menu when someone's ordering a price range. And that was like a real like bulb in my head moment, Kelli, because when I ask someone, what are they looking for? They say a cab. And I'll say out loud, would you like $10, $20, $30? Not thinking that other people may hear that, but I should really just be pointing to maybe the price on the shelf type of thing. So I wanted to kind of get your feedback on that.
Well, all of that sort of practical advice that I give in the book, it's all born from just stories of personal humiliation, because as a wine professional that worked in retail and as a floor sommelier, I would do something wrong and I would get called out on it. And then I would think, okay, I'm going to change this. So I'm sure I did that too forever. And I had an experience at the restaurant where somebody was a very knowledgeable and regular clientele was entertaining a group, and they asked about a specific bottle of wine. And now I knew from this person's behavior, they were likely going to pick up the whole tab. But they were asking about a wine that we had just gotten that I hadn't put on the list yet. And so I volunteered the price verbally in front of the group, and thinking nothing of it, we finished the conversation and left the table. And that person tracked me down and said, listen, it's fine, but don't ever talk about money in front of my guests again. And I was really taken aback, a little bit annoyed, but also because, that's the sort of nature of the transaction. But also I chose to not feel offended and to really think about that. And I thought, okay, in this instance, it was sensitive because it was a very high price. But I could see how somebody on the other end of the spectrum might actually be really interested in ordering a less expensive bottle of wine and also not wanting their guests to know that. It's a sensitive thing. And if somebody is buying wine for the group or making sort of group decisions, they might not want everybody to know what they're spending spending. And so it changed my behavior, and I started to treat the subject with a lot more discretion. But the reason why I think it's important is because we still have to talk about it. I mean, I'm sure you've been in a situation where somebody doesn't want to say what they want to spend, and they're being a little bit kind of cutesy or cagey about it. And they're
cagey, that's the word I was thinking of.
Forcing you to guess what they want to spend. And that's just a hot mess, because who knows, they could want to spend $10, they could want to spend $1,000, and you're wasting all of this time, the little limited time you have to execute this transaction, dancing around like, well, what about this or what about that? And then if they reject your idea, is it because of the price? Is it because you don't like the wine? What is it? The more clear, the more clarity we can introduce into these really murky interactions, the better for everybody. So that's a lot of where I put the energy in. Like, here's how you order wine. Here's how you talk to wine people, is like, let's cut through to the chase. Where we can be clear, let's be clear, because talking about wine is really murky. So we can be clear on this other stuff and save the time. Let's do that.
It's like wine is murky enough, and then money is also murky. So putting them together, it can get
all very sensitive.
Yeah, so sensitive. Absolutely.
In talking about ordering in a restaurant, you highlighted this point a lot about take the list. And this is something Kim and I have discussed on the show a few times, where when Kim is out at a restaurant and they don't give Kim the list, and she kind of says, I'm the person ordering. Usually the list is given to the head of the table or the man. So can you talk about why you really stress that, to take the list?
Well, I just think that there is all sorts of reasons to enjoy wine, right? Hopefully you find it delicious. It has all of these wonderful layers to it, as we've just discussed. But also, let's just be honest in that choosing wine in a restaurant, even if it's just for one other person, but especially if it's for a group in a business situation, that's a kind of a power move, right? Like, it's an opportunity to control the direction an evening takes, to make a statement. And so I think that there is a lot of power in wine knowledge. And so with the last chapter of the book, I interview all these people that have used a little bit of wine knowledge to the benefit of their career outside of wine. Now, I'm not talking about wine jobs, right? Like other kinds of fields of work, to the benefit of their financial standing, to the benefit of their social standing, right? I talked to a lot of people who used wine knowledge as a way to form connections with people in different socioeconomic groups than them, right? Like a young filmmaker who was in his 20s, who happened to learn about wine, be very passionate about wine. Suddenly he had a reason to engage in conversation with filmmakers that were in their 50s, these same people who might be giving him life-changing career opportunities. He couldn't just tug on their coattails and be like, I want to talk about Stanley Kubrick. Everybody wants to talk to these guys about that. But wine gave him an opportunity to stand out from the crowd and to engage in a different kind of a conversation. Talk to people who used ordering because had a little bit of wine knowledge, and then all of a sudden they're at business dinners and they're handed the wine list by their boss because they're known as the person to order wine. And so now they are in a position of power. I heard about an MBA professor who brings his students up to wine country because he feels that more business deals are formed at the dinner table than in the boardroom. And so it's like, it's kind of, you can view as a proxy for things like golf or watches or whatever. But in some ways it's easier to learn about wine. There's fewer barriers to entry in a certain regard. So there's power in learning about wine. And so my point was, if you spend your whole life being intimidated by wine and waiting for somebody to give you the list, you're never going to get there. So take it, even if you don't feel quite ready, like there's power in that opportunity and you should seize it.
It seems like a little of that old fashioned, like knowing which fork to use, but it's absolutely true, because at some point in your career, you will be going out to dinner with people who are above you on the professional food chain. And if you have something that demonstrates that you've got that little something different, there is power there. Absolutely. I love that. Oh, I love that so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kelli. We appreciate everything, and thank you for the great wine book. It was an eye-opener for me, reading through it.
Thank you so much. I love what you do. I'm thrilled to be here. Massachusetts, all the way.
Yeah, come visit us the next time you come home to Massachusetts. We've got... I think we have a long line of people who are, native to here that we've spoken to on our show, and we always welcome people home when they come back.
I would love that. Thank you so much. I'm going to take you up on that.
Fabulous.
Thank you for joining us today on The Wonderful World of Wine. We've been your hosts, Mark Lenzi and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. Our program is supported by Franklin Public Radio. Today, our special guest was Kelli White. Her latest book is Wine Confident. There's no wrong way to enjoy wine. Her website is Napa Valley Then and Now. And if you're in Napa, please visit her at Meadowood. You can find more information about Kim and I on our website, thewww.wine. Cheers.
Cheers.